So if you're here, you want to learn watercolor and you also want to know how to better the skills, what kind of techniques you are missing, and this is the space for you because I'm going to be sharing with you the whole list of skills and techniques that you need in order to master loose florals. Now let me tell you about being a self-taught watercolor artist. When I wanted to do watercolor, I thought since the internet had so much information to offer me, why do I need to do a workshop? I just felt like I could access all of these glorious tutorials from start to finish. I could also access blogs. There were so many different avenues for me to tap into to learn this new skill. Now, one of the mistakes that I had was I jumped straight into figuring out how to paint something meaningful, and that was a rose. I basically found tutorials to teach me how to paint a rose. Now, as I was doing all of these tutorials, one thing I realized was that I did not have the foundational skills that were required for me to even do some of these practices. Think about it in this way. I was basically expected to climb a mountain when I had not even learned to walk, pull myself out to stand, or even run. And from that, I was already wanting to climb a mountain. And this is where so many of us have this giant gap in terms of skills, where we are right now versus where we hope to be. And I'm hoping that this very checklist is going to help you to bridge that gap so that you are better able to understand where you are at in your journey right now and what specific skills that you need to help you to slowly scaffold your journey so that you achieve as much success as possible. Now, as I am sharing with you all those techniques, I am also going to be showing you my start to finish process of a wildflower painting that I did. These wildflowers were picked out from an in-person workshop and I brought it back to my studio and I painted it. I want you to see how I actually break it down, and you are definitely allowed to paint along together with me as well. Now, I want to tell you, please stay to the end because at the end, I'm also going to be sharing with you the biggest thing that can help you with your journey. And I can't wait for you to dive in. If you've got any questions, please leave it in the comments below. And of course, if you are new to my channel, welcome. Please subscribe to my channel because every week on Monday, I'm going to be sharing one new video, and this is where you get to see me show up in different ways, whether it's through tutorials or even chats and so on. I also want to invite you to tell me if there's any topics that are of interest to you so that we can add it into this channel. Now, without further ado, let's jump in. I got this beautiful bunch of wildflowers from a market for me to do an in-person workshop where I love to show my participants actual flowers, to show them how flowers are formed, the way in which they move and bend so that it's easier for them to visualize and translate all of this on paper. And if you're new to my channel, my name is Jillian. I'm a watercolor artist who love helping people to simplify and break down watercolor in ways that are easy so that we reduce the frustration and discouragement that could come with learning a new skill. I started my own journey as a watercolor hobbyist, trying to figure out the ropes of watercolor on YouTube, blogs, watercolor books that I borrow from libraries. And I have to tell you that when I started out, it was a very bumpy road because I was not able to navigate how to use water in my paintings. I got frustrated at how my brush worked on paper, and the worst thing was that I often felt like the outcome that I was able to produce versus what I saw in the books and on video was always so different. It was so hard for me to understand how is it that I was following the instructions step by step and still not being able to get to where I wanted to be. Today in this video, I wanted to let you in on the various skills that are required when you are new to watercolor, or even if you have been watercoloring for a while, to understand what exactly are the ingredients and skills and techniques that you need as a watercolor artist in order to master this tricky yet beautiful art. I'm going to be focusing this video more on techniques and skills, so if you've got any questions about supplies, because of course before we start any craft, knowing our supplies is so important. I have put a link where you can download my free PDF where I've written about the 5 things I wish I knew about watercolor supplies when I first started. This PDF is going to walk you through all the various mistakes that I made and how you can avoid them so that you can create and curate the supplies that are best suited to the type of paintings that you want. And also, I'm hoping that this helps you to fast track and cut away all of the wastage that you might have if you are planning on buying supplies and trying out this new craft. Now let's go into the very first technique that so many of us need to try when we are doing watercolor, and that is what you actually been seeing me do with this painting, would be understanding exactly how your brush works. So doing mark making and understanding all the various brush strokes related to loose florals is going to help you so much, because then you can manipulate your brush in a way that is intuitive and it allows you to just capture the essence of the flower easily without actually drawing out your flower. Now the thing about loose florals that is really tricky is that we don't really draw out pencil marks to shape how exactly the flower should form on the paper, and I think this is why it's so hard for people to visualize what exactly is going through the artist's mind when you're watching a video versus what's going through your mind. And as a result, so many of us translate these skills in different ways. If you understand how to use your brush, it is going to be so easy for you to map out the various strokes and match them to the petal shapes or even the floral shapes. If you have not and skipped this very step, I would encourage you to go back, pick up whatever brush that is your favorite or whatever brush that you have in your toolkit. Just make marks on your paper, dragging it across the paper, holding it upright, holding it close to the brush tip, holding it at a handle, kind of figuring out how the brush feels in your hand, and then creating all of these marks would give you so much perspective and possibility, and that way you can also see what you can create rather than drawing out the petals when you are painting loose florals. Technique number 2 is what so many of us start off with, which is wet in dry, where we are picking up our wet brush that is loaded with paint and putting and applying it on paper. Now, wet in dry technique is important where we have to understand how much water versus paint we need to have in our brush. So loading your brush is going to be another skill that you need to learn to be able to adjust your paint is to water ratio on your brush. Many of us struggle with having too much water on our brush or too little water on our brush, and as a result you get either sopping wet paintings or extremely dry strokes. So going into just playing around with scrap paper and applying different consistencies of paint and water in your brush onto the paper is going to help you to kind of understand and figure out what consistency works best and where you're comfortable with when you are applying paint on your paper. And this here is your wet and dry technique. The next technique that we would usually go into would be our wet in wet technique, and this is one of my favorite techniques. However, it can also be really tricky, and the tricky part about wet in wet technique is how we wet the paper and we go in with a wet brush, whether it's with paint or with water. And wet in wet technique really gives you so much versatility It gives you all of those beautiful blends, bleeds that is classic of watercolor. While so many of us love the blends, bleeds, and transparency of watercolor, it can also be a very frustrating effect to work with, especially when we realize that we overwork our paintings. One of the crucial things in Wet in Wet is understanding how exactly to wet the paper. And there is a specific way in which you can do it so that there is an even layer of water on your paper and you don't actually oversaturate the paper, which results in so much of those blooms, backwash, or even hard lines when you're painting. I run a deep dive course in this called From Blobs to Blooms that addresses all of these issues related to managing water. I will be listing all the information of the courses and workshops that you can learn through me on some of these topics if you find that you struggle in some of these areas. The next technique and skill that really transformed and changed my painting was understanding color values. And color values is basically knowing the darkness and lightness of color in your paintings so that you're able to identify light and shadow when you're painting a specific subject. Now here what you see me doing is I'm layering my paintings to give it more depth by adding in different dark and light areas so that I'm better able to show the viewer where exactly the light and shadow is. Now this part can be really tricky if we are painting from one layer or if we find that we don't know how best to add the shadows and the light in our painting. So painting in monochrome is one way in which you can try and improve this very skill. When you focus on just one color, you would be able to cut the distraction of color and also focus on just shapes instead of focusing on what's the next color to pick. If you think about it, while you're painting florals in a bouquet, you don't usually have multiple colors in one particular flower in the bouquet. You adjust the darkness and lightness by adjusting the amount of water that you have in your brush so that you're able to get darker or lighter saturation in colors. So this is going to be such an important technique to focus on, and if you have skipped this step, I would encourage you to revisit it, whether it's by doing color value studies or even getting a better understanding of floral shape. Now, speaking of floral shapes, this is the next technique that I think is essential for painting loose florals, which is understanding the direction in which flowers sit when they are in the space. So many of us know that perspective and direction of flowers vary depending on where they are facing, and we don't only capture flowers that are front facing, there's also side facing, down facing, and there's so many different directions and perspectives that flowers can take. This is where mapping out the various perspectives and shape of flowers is going to help so much when you are painting loosely. Once you understand exactly how to capture floral perspective, this is also going to give your painting more interest because you are better able to identify how best to play around with floral shapes to give your painting more variation instead of just one single type of floral direction. As you continue painting, composition becomes the next piece of the puzzle that kind of makes a whole painting cohesive, and composition does not only include understanding how to put elements on a piece of paper, but rather how to create depth, whether it's through negative painting, the use of color, aerial perspective, and all of these things like planning your painting will really help to elevate your entire painting. We want to think about things like focal point, creating unity, harmony in your color selection, as well as creating contrast so that certain figures and things stand out in your painting. Composition is really a mix and mash of all the various techniques put together. We don't only rely on one technique at a time, whether it's only using brushwork and mark making without using wet in wet technique. We are going to be mixing and matching every different technique together to get the various effects that we want, whether it's with blurred, soft edges, or whether we want to bring a specific subject to the focal point, or even using color to help us to harmonize and show light and shadow in our painting. Talking about color, color is the next thing that so many of us have to master, whether it is understanding their relationship in relation to the color wheel, or figuring out how to select colors, or even understanding the various terms and terminology surrounding color so that you get to ask questions around color with those particular terminology. Now, apart from understanding color, we also need to know how exactly we can use both neutrals and pops of color to create a composition that is cohesive throughout a painting. So all of these techniques stack and build up on each other. We can't really see them in isolation. However, at the same time, when you want to start off with this skill, it's so important to focus on one skill at a time so that as you slowly grow as an emerging artist, you're going to grow in confidence as well because you know that you have already met that specific milestone before moving on to the next one. I think one of the mistakes that I made as a self-taught watercolor artist was jumping into all of these tutorials which had a mix and match of these various techniques put together, and I had no idea that I had to hone in on specific skills first and that I was actually struggling with the very basics even before going into things like composition or layering or even glazing and underpainting. So I would encourage you to reflect on your practice as a big picture and see where you are at right now to understand where those gaps are so that you can fill it in as you're painting. Now, I'm also happy and excited to share that through my journey as a self-taught watercolor artist, I have developed a course that is meant to help self-taught watercolor artists to fill in the various gaps in their learning, and I want to help you to grow in confidence with the existing skills that you have so that you can create paintings with more intention and purpose. My hope is that through this course, you stop relying on step-by-step tutorials and use your knowledge with more intention to paint something that you're proud to call your own. At the same time, understand all the various languages and terms in watercolor so that you can ask the right questions to help you to find the answers for things that you've been seeking. This is also a course that is going to help you to experience success in a steady manner because we want to make sure that you understand all the techniques that are stacked on top of each other so that you get to prioritize art more and make it a more sustainable and creative practice with that newfound confidence that you have. In this course, I specifically prioritize application beyond just techniques because I feel like so many of us already have the head knowledge, but we don't know how to put it down into practice. And I feel like this is the giant gap that most of us have when we are learning. And this was also the big gap or hole that I had as a self-taught watercolor artist. I knew exactly what wet in wet was or wet in dry was, but I had difficulty understanding when exactly to use it and how to apply it in a painting or when I was looking at a reference photo. So my hope for you is that this course is going to help you to fill in gaps in your learning and hopefully show you how exactly to apply these skills so that you get more light bulb moments of your own and create in a style that is truly yours. I cannot wait for you to dive into the course, but of course, I would continue to support you here on this channel where I will be sharing with you tutorials and all things watercolor. So if you are not subscribed to this channel and if you enjoy my content, remember to hit the subscribe button. Leave me a comment below on the various techniques and skills that you struggle with or you love when it comes to watercolor, because this is going to help me understand what exactly about watercolor is exciting and difficult when you are painting. I can't wait to see you in the next video. Thank you so much for being here with me today. I'll see you again next week.